At my own daughter's wedding, her new husband humiliated me in front of 200 guests. He saw me as just a poor old widow he could walk all over. He mocked my simple life and laughed about how I was too broke to chip in for their party. And my daughter just stood there and let him do it. But they had no idea I was a secret multimillionaire and that I owned his entire family's company. They got exactly what they deserved, and my perfect revenge was so satisfying. You know the sound of champagne glasses clinking is supposed to be happy, but sitting there in the corner of that grand ballroom, it just sounded like the rattling of a cage. A beautiful gilded cage, but a cage all the same. My daughter Emily was across the room, absolutely glowing. Her dress must have cost more than my first little house, and she was laughing, her head thrown back with the kind of freedom only youth and a lot of money can buy. Her new husband, Logan Rivers, was holding court beside her. He was all polished teeth and shiny cufflinks, a real peacock, in a suit that was probably stitched by hand in some fancy shop in London. And I could feel his eyes on me. He'd been circling me all night, and I knew it was only a matter of time. I felt a little buzz from the purse on my lap. It was my diabetes monitor, a quiet little reminder of the stress that was churning in my gut and making my blood sugar climb. The whole thing had started during the toasts. Logan had stood up, raising his glass with a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. He'd decided to tell a story, a little anecdote about his new mother-in-law. He told the whole room 200 of Greenwich's finest. How my secret to a happy life was a good book and a clean bill of health. Then he paused for effect and added that he and Emily were aiming just a little bit higher than that. A wave of laughter rippled through his side of the room. That cold, polite laughter of people who think they're better than you. I saw Emily's smile falter for just a second, but she didn't say a word. She just squeezed his arm, a tiny gesture of allegiance that felt like a punch to my stomach. Sure enough, a few minutes later, he was making his way over to my table. He moved like a predator that had scented weakness. He leaned over, his voice dripping with a kind of false friendliness that's worse than outright meanness. He asked if I was enjoying the party, guessing it was a bit more extravagant than my usual Tuesday night bingo. He even winked at his groomsmen, who snickered right on cue. I just looked at him, keeping my voice perfectly even, and told him it was a beautiful wedding. And it was. A beautiful, hollow wedding. My late husband David would have hated it. David built a software empire from nothing, but he never forgot where he came from. He valued humility and kindness, two things this young man knew absolutely nothing about. Logan heard my comment and pounced on it. He said it was beautiful and expensive, speaking loud enough for the tables around us to hear. He told me not to worry, that they weren't expecting me to chip in. He knew things had been tight since David passed away. He even had the nerve to pat my hand, a fake gesture of sympathy that was meant to put me in my place. And that's when the public humiliation became a physical thing. I could feel my blood sugar spike, that familiar, sickening sweetness on my tongue. He saw me as a doddering old widow, a harmless relic to be tolerated and pitied. He had no idea. He had no idea that David's tight estate was actually a labyrinth of trusts and holding companies so brilliantly complex that it took a team of the best lawyers in the country a full year to untangle. He had no idea that it left me with a controlling interest in dozens of ventures, including, as of 6 months ago, a majority share in a struggling but reputable East Coast investment firm called Rivers & Sons. Just then, Emily drifted over. Her expression was a mix of champagne fizz and real anxiety. She asked if I was okay, saying I looked a little pale. I told her I was fine, just a little tired. I looked past her at her new husband, who was now laughing with his father, the firm's CEO. They were so confident, so oblivious, sealed inside their perfect gilded world. Logan caught my eye from across the room and raised his glass to me in a little mock toast. That was it. That was the real betrayal. It wasn't just his cruelty, it was my daughter's silence. She had chosen this world of shallow performance over the quiet, unshakable strength I had tried so hard to teach her. That's when I saw him standing near the bar. Arthur Vance, my senior financial advisor, the public face of my portfolio, a man who looked so average you'd never guess he managed billions. I met his gaze across the crowded room, and I gave him the smallest, most imperceptible nod you could imagine. The game was on. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. The moment I gave the nod, I watched Arthur detach himself from the bar. He's a master of camouflage, you see. His suits are so bland and gray, his manner so mild, that he can move through a room like this completely unnoticed. He navigated the crowd with this unhurried ease like a shark that knows it owns the water, and I watched as he intercepted Logan's father, Richard Rivers. He approached him with a warm, disarming smile, the kind that invites you to lower your guard. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. I've seen Arthur work before. He's a surgeon with words, and he was about to make his first incision. I saw Richard's jovial, backslapping expression just freeze. His smile tightened, and he glanced nervously over at Logan, who was still preening for his friends, completely oblivious. Arthur said something else, his expression still one of mild professional curiosity. And that's when Richard's face went completely ashen. It was like all the blood had drained right out of him. He set his champagne glass down with a shaking hand and pulled Logan aside. His movements were no longer relaxed and confident. They were sharp, panicked. Their whispered conversation was frantic. I could see Logan's bravado just evaporate, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated fear. He started scanning the room, his eyes wide until they locked on Arthur, who was now calmly sipping a club soda as if he were discussing the weather. Then his gaze darted across the room and found me. And for the very first time, he looked at me not with contempt, but with a dawning, horrified suspicion. The panic was immediate and chaotic. Logan and his father started moving through the crowd, trying to act casual, but it was a complete failure. They were trying to build a lie on a foundation of sand. I saw Logan corner his cousin, some junior partner at the firm, who was already half drunk and just looked confused by Logan's frantic intensity. The stories were already starting to contradict each other. One moment, it was about a routine audit. The next, it was a potential merger. Their clumsy, amateurish scrambling told me everything I needed to know. They were guilty, and they were in over their heads. That was my cue. I seized the moment, slipping away from my table and finding a quiet alcove near the restrooms. The cool marble of the hallway felt good against my skin. I pulled out my phone, my hands perfectly steady, and sent a single pre-written text to Arthur. It just said, Phase 2. This was our first real move, the one that established him as my public ally, my bishop on the board. When I returned to the ballroom, the whole atmosphere had shifted. Logan's arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a tense, watchful paranoia. He went over to Emily, his smile a tight, unnatural grimace. He whispered something in her ear, and I saw her look over at me. Her brow furrowed with a new kind of worry. The gilded cage had just become a prison and the walls were closing in. They felt exposed, and I knew that in their fear they would try to tighten their control. Logan put his arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her closer to him. It wasn't a gesture of affection anymore. It was one of possession. He was building a wall around her, a wall he thought would protect him from me. He had no idea he'd just trapped himself inside with me. The next morning, just as I was finishing my tea, the phone rang. It was Emily. Her voice was thin, stretched tight with a forced cheerfulness that didn't hide the pleading underneath. She told me Logan had explained everything. It was all just a big misunderstanding with an investor, she said, and he was so incredibly stressed about it. She begged me not to take anything he'd said last night to heart, explaining that he was just performing for his friends. That was the word she used, performing. As if his cruelty were a role he was playing in a stage play. I took a slow breath and made my voice sound deliberately frail, a little shaky. I told her, of course, dear, it was a very long night, and all the excitement had tired me out. I said I thought it was best if I just rested for a few days to get my strength back. This was my strategic retreat. Let them think the panic was over. Let them think their little cover story had worked. Let them put the old woman back in her box where they felt she belonged. I could almost hear the relief in Emily's voice as she agreed that was an excellent idea. Of course, I didn't know the full extent of their panic then. I only found out later, once Arthur's team started their deep dive, what was really happening in Logan's world that morning. While I was playing the part of the frail widow needing her rest, Logan wasn't on a honeymoon brunch with my daughter. He was in his sleek, minimalist office overlooking the Long Island Sound, sweating through his $1,000 shirt. He was on a conference call, and the voice on the other end was cold and unforgiving. The quarterly projections were soft, the voice said. The big tech fund, they'd leveraged everything on a complete dud. The man on the phone made it clear if Rivers & Sons didn't secure a major capital infusion by the end of the fiscal year, they were facing insolvency. The entire empire, the family legacy, the social standing, the whole performance was nothing but a house of cards. His cruelty to me hadn't been about fun. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt by a drowning man to feel powerful by pushing someone else's head under the water. So while they thought I was at home, nursing my feelings and sipping chamomile tea, I was actually in Arthur's downtown Stamford office. It was a war room, quiet and cool, with walls of monitors displaying stock tickers and market analyses. Arthur handed me a file, his face grim. He told me they were even more desperate than we'd initially thought. They had been cooking the books for 2 quarters, hiding massive losses in offshore shell corporations. He called their work sloppy and arrogant. They never thought anyone would be powerful enough or smart enough to look. We spent the rest of the day preparing for Phase 2. Arthur's team located the original proxy votes from the acquisition David had made all those years ago, the dusty documents that granted me ultimate authority. Holding them in my hands felt like holding David's hand one last time. We drafted the resolutions, the sharp, precise motions that would be brought before the emergency board meeting Arthur was now legally authorized to call. Later that afternoon, back at my own house, a delivery van pulled up. It was a ridiculously expensive bouquet of flowers so large it barely fit through the door. The card nestled among 24 white roses was from Logan. It was a short, simple note. He was so sorry for the stress, it read. And then the final fatal mistake. He wrote that perhaps it was best to let the men handle the business from here on out. He had completely underestimated me. He saw a silly old woman who could be placated with flowers and a pat on the head. He had no idea he'd just handed me the last ounce of fuel I needed. He hadn't just insulted my intelligence. He had insulted my husband's legacy. The post-wedding brunch was held at the Rivers palatial estate, a sprawling mansion that seemed designed to make people feel small. The mood on the stone terrace was thick with a kind of forced cheerfulness. Everyone was sipping mimosas and pretending that the awkwardness from the wedding reception had never happened. Logan was back to his old self, the peacock preening for the wedding party. He had completely convinced himself that the incident with Arthur was just a minor scare, a little blip that had been successfully managed. He was so confident, in fact, that he didn't even bother to look my way. In his mind, I was once again the insignificant old woman dealt with and dismissed. They were just serving dessert, some fancy raspberry mousse in a tiny glass, when Arthur Vance arrived. He wasn't on the guest list. He just walked onto the terrace, a quiet man in a bland gray suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He moved with an unshakable authority that made the cheerful chatter falter and die. He walked directly to the center of the party and addressed Richard and Logan, his voice polite but firm, cutting through the silence. He apologized for the intrusion, but explained that he had an urgent matter to discuss. He didn't wait for an invitation. He placed his briefcase on a table and opened it, revealing a set of professionally bound documents. He announced to the stunned group that what he held was a formal notice of an emergency shareholder meeting, and he added a motion to call for a full independent audit of the firm's financials effective immediately. Faced with those irrefutable official-looking papers, Logan finally broke. All the pretense of sophistication vanished, replaced by the raw, cornered animal fury I knew was hiding underneath. He whirled around and pointed a trembling finger at me, his face a twisted mask of rage. He snarled that this was my doing. His father hissed at him to stop, but the dam had burst. Logan started shouting at Arthur, his voice cracking, yelling that I had sent him, that I was trying to ruin him, and then it all just came pouring out. The confession was a torrent of desperation and shame, a litany of his failures. He gasped that the tech fund had collapsed, the words tumbling over each other. He admitted they were broke, that they had been for months. He said he just needed to project confidence to hold it all together until he could close some big merger. He turned to Emily, his eyes wild with a panic that was terrifying to see. He yelled that this was why the wedding had to be so perfect, so over the top. They needed to look successful. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Logan's mother began to weep quietly into her napkin. His father, Richard, just stared at him with a mixture of horror and pure contempt. The carefully constructed family image shattered into a million pieces right there on the sunny terrace. The conspiracy of silence was broken, and you could see the blame starting to fly as other family members began to realize the depth of the deception. In the middle of all that chaos, I remained perfectly still. I was no longer the victim. I was no longer the frail old woman in the corner. I was the center of gravity in their collapsing universe. I looked at my daughter. Emily's face was a mask of shock and a dawning, horrified comprehension. She was finally seeing the man she had married stripped bare of his wealth and his arrogance. All that was left was a terrified, hollow shell. Arthur waited for a moment of quiet. Into the silence, he announced that the meeting was scheduled for the next morning at 10 o'clock. He calmly packed his briefcase, gave me a subtle nod that no one else would have understood, and left. He left the Rivers family to drown in the wreckage of their own lies. I had taken control of the narrative. They were now powerless, and I knew they were terrified of the public reckoning that was still to come. The emergency shareholder meeting wasn't held in some sterile private boardroom. That would have been too merciful. At my instruction, Arthur had arranged it for 10 o'clock sharp in the grand library of the Greenwich Yacht Club. It was a cathedral of old money and public scrutiny, all dark wood and leather-bound books where reputations were made and broken over quiet handshakes. I wanted witnesses. The entire board was present, along with the key senior partners, but most importantly, Arthur had invited several influential figures from the Greenwich financial community. These were the people whose opinions were currency, whose whispers could make or break a man. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a tribunal. Logan and his father arrived looking like ghosts. They were haggard, their expensive suits hanging on them like costumes, their faces pale with a sleepless, sweating dread. My daughter Emily was with them, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but she didn't sit with them. In a small but powerful act of separation, she chose a chair in the back of the room near me. She didn't look at me, but I knew she was there. I didn't say a word. I let Arthur take the floor, introducing himself as the proxy for the firm's largest and so far anonymous stakeholder. He began to systematically and dispassionately present the preliminary findings of the audit. He used charts and projections on a large screen, laying bare the financial rot that went to the very core of Rivers & Sons. He calmly detailed the hidden losses, the over-leveraged assets, the sloppy, arrogant way they had cooked the books. With each slide, another layer of the Rivers lie was stripped away. The judgment didn't come from me. It came from the gasps and shocked murmurs of the men sitting around the polished mahogany table. It came from the looks of disgust and disappointment on the faces of their peers. This is how justice works in their world, not with jail time, but with the complete and utter loss of status. Finally, Richard Rivers, a broken man, struggled to his feet. He couldn't even look at his peers. He just stared at the table and whispered that it was true. He said they had made errors in judgment. Logan remained silent, staring at the polished surface of the table as if it were a life raft that was slowly sinking. Then Arthur delivered the final blow. He announced that there was one final piece of business. His voice rang with a new clarity and force. He stated that the majority shareholder had decided it was time to take a more active role in the firm's future. The motion on the floor, he declared, was to remove Richard Rivers as CEO and Logan Rivers from the board of directors, effective immediately. A stunned silence fell over the room. One of the older board members, a pompous man named Harrington, gave a little scoff. He asked who this mysterious majority shareholder was who suddenly had the authority to do all this. Arthur didn't answer him. He turned and looked directly at me across the silent room. I met his gaze and I gave a slight, almost imperceptible, regal nod. Arthur turned back to the board. His voice echoed in the silent, wood-paneled library. He told them her name was Catherine Doyle, the firm's new chairwoman. You could have heard a pin drop. A collective gasp went through the room. Every single head swiveled to look at me, the quiet, unassuming widow in the corner. Logan's head snapped up. His face was a grotesque mask of disbelief and absolute soul-crushing horror. He looked from me to Arthur and back again, the truth finally crashing down on him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered. He had been annihilated by the one person in the world he considered utterly insignificant. This was the final proportionate consequence. I hadn't taken his money. I had simply reclaimed what was always mine, and in doing so I had nullified his entire identity. Without the name, the status, the illusion of power, he was nothing. The aftermath was as swift as it was brutal. In a town like Greenwich, news travels faster than market fluctuations, and the story of the hostile takeover, led by the scorned mother-in-law, became the talk of every cocktail party and country club dinner. The Rivers family wasn't just defeated, they were socially and financially ruined. They were forced to sell that palatial estate, their memberships to the yacht club, and the country club were unceremoniously revoked, and their name became a cautionary tale, a story whispered to arrogant young men as a warning. From what I heard, the antagonists chose very different paths. Richard Rivers, humbled and completely broken, accepted the consequences. He retired in disgrace, a man stripped of his legacy, and retreated into a quiet, self-imposed exile. Logan, however, remained bitter and in denial. The reports I got painted a picture of a man blaming everyone but himself, unable to grasp that his own arrogance was the architect of his downfall. He and Emily filed for divorce within a month. My new reality began the day after the meeting. My daughter came to my modest, comfortable home, the very home Logan had so openly mocked, And for the first time since she was a little girl, she just wept in my arms. Her apology came out in a flood of tears and ragged breaths. She told me how sorry she was, how stupid she had been. She said she had believed in all the wrong things, the shine and the status, and had forgotten everything I ever taught her. There are no easy fixes for a betrayal like that, but it was a start. The long, difficult path to rebuilding our relationship began right there, not with recriminations or any "I told you so" geet, but with a shared, quiet understanding. And me, I thrived. I appointed Arthur as the new CEO of the restructured firm, which we officially renamed the David Doyle Group in honor of my late husband. We changed the company's entire mission. We started focusing on ethical investments, on supporting small businesses and entrepreneurs who had good ideas but couldn't get a fair shot. It gave me a new purpose, a quiet, authentic peace that no amount of money could ever buy. My life was no longer about reacting to the cruelty of others. It was about proactively creating a legacy of integrity and strength, the way David always had. 6 months later, Emily and I were having lunch in a small cafe downtown. She was quieter these days, more thoughtful. She'd taken a job at a local nonprofit, helping to organize community gardens. For the first time in years, she seemed genuinely happy, her light coming from within instead of from the things she owned. As we were talking, I saw a man who looked vaguely familiar walk past the window on the other side of the street. It took me a moment to place him. It was Logan. He looked diminished. His expensive custom-tailored suit was gone, replaced by an ill-fitting polo shirt. He was thinner, and that arrogant swagger had been replaced by a defeated slump in his shoulders. He didn't see us. He was just another man stripped of his power and his prestige. And as I watched him disappear down the street, I felt no anger, no triumph. There was only a quiet, final sense of peace. The new dynamic was permanent. I was strong. My daughter was free, and the consequences for those who had wronged us were a lasting reality they had created entirely for themselves. My pain had been transformed into wisdom. In the end, Catherine's story wasn't just about revenge. It was a powerful lesson in quiet strength. It showed that while understanding the desperate fear that drove her son-in-law was a form of wisdom, it was never an excuse for his cruelty. She proved that true power isn't about inflicting pain, but about restoring balance with precision and grace. The ultimate justice she delivered was not in his destruction but in her own peace, forcing him to confront the emptiness he had created all by himself, and reminding everyone that true worth is never determined by the judgment of others.